as we're finding ourselves in times of great upheaval and in profound shifts, both in nature, in the systems that we have created, and now one of the leading nations of this planet are changing their leader. And I'm not at all involved in politics and the societal structures. I'm only watching the energies and how they represent something much, much bigger. And the shifts that are going on now, both with natural disasters, Mother Earth is purifying to the deepest of her core. People are going through their personal processes on all levels, physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, and also in their external realities. A lot of things are transforming and dissolving, collapsing also. And at the same time as we can have a lot of compassion and kindness for each other and for everything that is going on, I think it's also quite useful to contemplate and reflect on how things ended up to be what it is right now and what we're going through, because then we can find some solace and some understanding on a mental level of what we have created. It's not only us. This goes back to ancient times, what we're living through right now in this present moment. But just to bring it a little bit back to the personal, to our personal aspects, and see how we can go back to our childhood. And we were born, all of the people that are here on the planet now, with a few exceptions, we were born and raised into a third dimensional reality experience. It's a matrix, it's an architecture that are built on polarities, and it's built on specific dynamics, which I often call the game of life. It is based on polarity, which means it always presents the extremes so that we can learn about ourselves and about the world around us through opposites. So basically, we're born into a world that teaches us judgment and separation. There's very little talk, except from religion, about our innate connection to Source. And the first 7 years of our lives, most of what we will experience in the rest of our lives are programmed. We are being fed all of the software that we're basically going to build our reality on. And so I think at this time, going back to that programming that was fed into us from very early age, and even worse, reinforced through all of our years growing up in the school systems, in all of the institutions that we have created, our family institutions, schooling system, medical system, all of the food and the diet. So there's like nothing in our reality that is not meticulously orchestrated in this matrix, because it's all built on the same dynamics. And so it is very beneficial and complementary for us to look at the truth of what that is, and what we are feeding into and what we are sustaining by looking the other way and not wanting to face what that is. Because we can only change what we are aware of. And from then on, things are easier. It's possible to navigate in a new direction once we know. But as long as we're in the dark, which is the absence of light, then it's worse. Then we are still susceptible to being puppets in a big play that we have no idea what it is about. So bringing in the light, which is information, which is truth, which is love, then we can step up and step into our power and do something about it. everything is built on the principles of the third dimension. And the third dimension is built, again, on separation and judgment. And its driving force is fear and lack and victim consciousness. So it's all a big soup of low frequent vibrations that we have built our worldview and our lives upon. So if we go back to really understanding the consequences of holding that in our operating system, operating from the mind, being very disconnected from our hearts, being very disconnected from nature and everything that is around us, being disconnected from source, or thinking that we are, being under the perception that we are disconnected from all other humans and that we have to fight for our part of the cake. That is when we end up with a reality experience that is a power play, where people are chasing and fighting and being put up against each other. The divisiveness that we see in the world now is just now coming to the surface to be seen. It has always been there, it's just that we have been comfortably numb. So leaning into this awareness can give us some acknowledgement and really understanding what role we can play in that, because everything is changeable. That is the good news. And it's quite easily changeable, but we have to turn our perspectives around and realize that we have the power to recreate this mess that we find ourselves in. And so going back to those 7 first years of our lives, and even less than that, there's something called primary defense mechanisms. And when a child doesn't have the proper guidance, when there's some form of neglect and traumatic experiences, they can be like just in regular life. It doesn't have to be like super harsh stuff happening. It can be only like a child being born into a family where they aren't seen and understood, where their needs aren't met. It can be basically anything. And traumatic events, they end up as somehow the child needs to cope with that. So if they don't have the proper guidance, and if they don't feel safe enough to have the responses that innately come to those traumatic experiences, they will develop something called coping mechanisms, is what lies in the word. It's when a child finds ways to handle the mental, emotional, physical situation that they're finding themselves in. And very often those coping mechanisms, especially the ones that are on the primary stage, like primary defense mechanisms, which is a coping mechanism, that is a very immature and unevolved way of coping with life. And then you have secondary. But what I have been very involved with looking at is the primary ones, because they are very related to narcissistic personality disorder and personality disorders as a group of psychological disorders, and many branches of that. Because when you don't have the proper environment to feel safe and seen and heard and loved, nurtured, and all of the things that a young child needs, then you will just try to find ways to cope. And often those strategies are quite destructive. And when in early life a child starts to develop these coping mechanisms, later on they build on these mechanisms and ways of coping with life, and it gets just bigger and bigger and bigger. And so a person who doesn't feel connected to source or to anything else around will eventually start building a story to believe in, a narrative that reaffirms a narrative that helps them feel safe, reinforce their identity and their self-image, which is often quite either inflated or deflated. It isn't oriented in the real world. And so the reason why I'm talking about this is that on a global stage right now, we have a lot of people who are suffering from many of these disorders. So without labeling it as a diagnose, this is not the purpose. So the purpose is to see how sick of a society we are, what we have evolved into because we have based all of our operating systems within on fear, lack, victim consciousness, and basically a complete disconnection from everything. And that is a species which is incredibly under-evolved, has a potential to eradicate itself because it doesn't really know what it takes to thrive. And even if you are not a person who has developed destructive, distorted ways of behaving and making priorities and choices that are not aligned with what we would call for the highest good of all, even if you're not in that category, very often, because we're all in this together, we all play parts in this grand play. We all have a piece in the puzzle where we either contribute to the status quo or we bring our energy into something else where we can create something new. Once we understand what we have created up until now and how we are still feeding into that mentally, emotionally, spiritually, physically ill, distorted society, Earth, humanity that we are right now. But the good news is the transformational shifts are already been happening behind the scenes for many, many years. And so what is purposeful and what empowers us is to allow for what is to be shown and to work with different tools to come to an acceptance for what is and what is truth, what is showing itself to me, and to get past the possible resistance that might be there, and possibly also fear and anger and grief, everything that comes when we allow for truth to come to the surface. It's a big process. But the first step is always to acknowledge and to accept. So that is how we step into our power. It is empowerment to have the courage to see what is. And from there on, it is possible to navigate. Because if we work in the dark, it's impossible to see where we're walking. And also impossible to see what we want to change and what we prefer. If we have only been served one broadcast, one frequency, which is the third dimensional, let's call it like one frequency, broadcasting for eons of time, which is everything that we have been immersed in our whole lives. It's very difficult to see anything else because you don't know it. So this is my work, and together with me, a whole bunch of beautiful light workers who are holding codes in their bodies, in their memories. Everything that they're doing is making all of this available so that we together can walk this path and create something new, something beautiful, which is not really new. It's more activating something that we already know, but that we have been distracted from, guided away from, that is very deeply buried inside of us. So I invite you to keep following, keep engaging, keep opening your heart, keep holding an open mind, and be an observer. Just watch and listen and engage and contribute with your beautiful, unique soul signature.